Imagine a war machine so perfectly hierarchical that every single one of its gears knew exactly how much power it had, how much it could demand, and how many men it could send to their deaths. The army of the Third Reich built a pyramid of authority that spanned from the lowest Schütze, the private who slept on wooden boards on the frozen fronts, to the General Feldmarschall who drew lines on maps from heated headquarters hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines. 21 degrees separated both extremes. 21 steps of command, honor, responsibility, and ultimately, complicity. This is the complete story of that hierarchy. The ranks that sustained the Third Reich, the men who occupied them, and the system that made them function like a clock until Hitler himself destroyed it with his own hands. Before continuing, I want to show you something that I think is especially worthwhile if you are a true World War II enthusiast. Over the past few months, we have worked on a collection dedicated exclusively to one of the most impressive episodes of the conflict, the Battle of Berlin in 1945. We have gathered more than 200 historical photographs, unpublished or very rarely seen, organized in a photographic collection that allows you to visually tour the final days of the Third Reich. The heritage of the Reichswehr and the birth of a new army. On March 16, 1935, Adolf Hitler publicly abrogated the military clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. With that decree, the limit of 100,000 men imposed on the German army since 1919 was rendered dead letter, but the structure that Hitler inherited and later transformed already carried a backbone that no treaty had been able to entirely destroy. The Reichswehr, that reduced army but one of technical and doctrinal quality unparalleled in Europe. The Reichswehr between 1919 and 1935 was, to a large extent, a seminary for officers and non-commissioned officers. Hans von Seeckt, head of the Troop Directorate between 1919 and 1926, turned those 100,000 men into something no enemy power had calculated. An elite cadre of instructors capable of multiplying the moment the limits disappeared. The officers learned to exercise functions 2 ranks above the one they held. A major thought like a major general, a captain planned like a colonel. The idea, described later by Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin in his campaign memoirs, was that when the time for expansion arrived, the system would not collapse for lack of competent cadres. The rank system that Hitler adopted and modified did not spring from nowhere the day he assumed power. It came from a Prussian tradition more than 200 years old, which the Kaiserreich and later the Reichswehr had refined into an almost perfect architecture of delegated authority and personal responsibility. To that heritage, the Nazi regime added its own layers, the Führerprinzip, the absolute leader principle, which ran through the entire chain of command from top to bottom. And then there was the structural problem that no subsequent historian could ignore. Hitler never wanted a clean, unified command. According to the testimony of General Mellenthin himself, recorded in his memoirs published in 1955, the Führer deliberately applied his old maxim of divide and rule even within the Wehrmacht. The army, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, the Waffen-SS, 4 parallel structures with their own ranks, their own chains of command, and frequently their own agendas. That fractured design was, at the same time, the source of internal tensions that weakened the Third Reich in its final years. The United States Army Manual known as TME 30-451, the Handbook on German Military Forces, published in 1945 for the use of Allied officers, offers a radiographic view of this system from the perspective of those who fought it. According to that document, the hierarchy of the German army was divided into three major blocks: enlisted troops, non-commissioned officers, and officers. Each block had its own subdivisions, its own marks of distinction on the uniform, and its own path of promotion. Understanding how each one worked is understanding how the Third Reich functioned at war. The base of the pyramid, the ranks of enlisted troops. Before there were chevrons, before there was any star on a shoulder strap, there were the enlisted men. The men who carried the rifle, who slept on the ground, who died in the greatest numbers and in the most absolute anonymity. The German army built its hierarchy from the bottom up, and to understand that foundation, who they were, how they promoted, what distinguished them from one another, is to understand the base upon which everything else rested: Schütze, the foot soldier. The Schütze was the starting point. The literal translation is marksman or rifleman, although in practice it designated any newly incorporated infantry soldier without any distinction of merit or specialization. He was the man who wielded the Karabiner 98K, who carried his combat equipment, between 16 and 20 kilograms in the field, and who slept in the barracks or, when the front moved, directly on the frozen ground. The living conditions of the Schütze on the Eastern Front are impossible to comprehend without concrete references. The barracks of the training areas in Germany, described in Manual TM-E30-451, were brick facilities housing between 150 and 200 men, with collective sanitary facilities and shared dining tables. The training camp had small arms shooting ranges and in some cases artillery grounds, but that was Germany. In the overseas fronts, the Schütze discovered a different reality. Guy Sayer, an Alsatian soldier who served in the German ranks and left his memoirs published decades later, described his training with these approximate words: "The combat course is the most severe physical challenge I have ever experienced. We were out of bed at 5 in the morning. Exhausted, drenched, we threw ourselves onto our mattresses each night, crushed by a demolishing sleep without even the energy to write to our families." The Schütze was technically neither a non-commissioned officer, nor did he have any command function. He received orders and executed them. His initial pay, according to the scale established before the war, was 1,080 Reichsmarks annually, the lowest of the entire scale. During the war, that salary became a reduced wartime pay that was supplemented by special combat front allowances. The rank admitted variants by specialty: grenadier for line infantry, cannoneer for artillery, pioneer for combat engineers, Funker for radio operators, Fahrer for drivers, Kraftfahrer for motor vehicle drivers, Jäger for light infantry elite troops, Reiter for cavalry. All started from the same point of the hierarchical scale, and all wore the same uniform without any visible rank insignia on the shoulder straps. Oberschütze, the first step of distinction. The Oberschütze, literally senior marksman, was the first grade to which a soldier could ascend without needing any formal selection process. It was, in practice, the recognition that someone had completed their basic training period and showed ordinary aptitude. It implied no command responsibility, no significant increase in authority. The first months of service were the sifting process. The basic training period of the German army, according to the documentation of TME 30-451, was structured as follows in peacetime. From November 1st to March 1st, the emphasis was placed on the individual development of the recruit. Starting in February, platoon and company tactical problems were introduced. In March, divisional inspections were carried out. In the last fortnight of March and 1st of April, battalions and regiments executed joint tactical exercises. And during the winter season, the general staffs of larger units, from the division upward, conducted map problems, a way to prepare command cadres for the challenges of the real front. That training system produced Oberschützen who, although without visible chevrons, were physically tougher and tactically more competent than the recruits of many Allied armies. Gefreiter and Obergefreiter, the first steps of real distinction. The Gefreiter is perhaps the best-known rank outside of Germany for a particular reason. Adolf Hitler held that rank during the First World War and continued to identify with it decades later, albeit more as a propaganda resource than as a relevant biographical fact. In the German army system of the Second World War, the Gefreiter was technically the first step above undistinguished enlisted personnel, but, and this is fundamental, Manual TME 30-451 points it out explicitly. The Gefreiter was not a non-commissioned officer in the German definition of the term. He wore a single chevron on his left arm, but had no formal command authority. To achieve the rank of Gefreiter, a soldier had to have earned it during his service, which in practice was measured through the evaluation of the company commander. Crucially, it was a prerequisite to be able to apply for access to the non-commissioned officer career. No one could be considered a candidate for Unteroffizier without first having passed through the rank of Gefreiter. The Obergefreiter added a second chevron. He was still not an NCO, but he already represented a trusted man within his unit. And the Stabsgefreiter, introduced later in the war, was the variant that recognized long-experienced soldiers who, for some reason, age, technical specialty, or personal preference, had not ascended to the rank of NCO, but who had irreplaceable practical value within their units. The non-commissioned officers, the backbone of the army. There was something the Germans understood better than almost any other army of the era: that wars are won by whoever has the best sergeants. Generals design plans, officers execute them. But it is the non-commissioned officers who decide whether a platoon advances or disintegrates when the first shell falls nearby. The NCO corps of the German army was, for years, the most valuable and least visible asset of the Third Reich's military machinery. The non-commissioned officer system, a different corps. The German army clearly distinguished between enlisted troops and NCOs, and that distinction was not merely administrative. It was cultural, functional, and practically irreversible. A soldier who ascended to the rank of Unteroffizier passed into a different world, one with specific command responsibilities, with a strong corporate identity, and with a training process that the army considered just as important as that of the officers themselves. The German NCO Corps before 1939 is estimated to have comprised between 70,000 and 90,000 men, approximately 1/10 of the Army's total force, and was composed overwhelmingly of long-service volunteers. The standard service period for the bulk of NCOs was 12 years. Those with special technical or administrative capabilities could extend that period up to 25 years of service. By 1939, this corps was one of the most valuable assets the German army possessed, deeply experienced men with consolidated command routines who served as indispensable transmitters between the officer's will and the troops' action. NCO training followed two different paths, according to TM-E 30-451. The first was internal. The recruit with aptitudes expressed his interest to the company commander at any time during his active service period. But the final decision was made toward the end of that period, once the commander had had enough time to observe the candidate's intelligence, character, and command capacity. The recruit also had to have reached the rank of Gefreiter during his normal service. The second path was the NCO schools. There were 5 of them in the German army, each with a staff of between 200 and 300 students. The course lasted 2 years. Volunteers between 18 and 20 years of age were accepted. The curriculum was predominantly practical, although it included some theoretical subjects. Graduates directly received the rank of Unteroffizier and were assigned to regiments, functioning as a leveling mechanism. Regiments recruited in rural areas that did not produce enough candidates received these graduates from the central schools. Unteroffizier, the first non-commissioned officer. The Unteroffizier was the formal entry point into the NCO Corps. He wore a silver braid band around the sides and bottom of the collar patch, visually marking the separation from the enlisted troops. His initial pay during the war was 1,636 Reichsmarks annually, considerably higher than that of the private. In practice, the Unteroffizier was the man who directly commanded the troops in the field. The squad leader, the man who knew the names of all his soldiers, who knew their strengths and weaknesses, who answered for them to his superiors. He was the hinge between the abstract orders of command and the dirty reality of combat. The Unterfeldwebel was the immediately superior step among junior NCOs, with the same responsibilities but greater credited experience and slightly higher pay. Feldwebel, the real sergeant. The Feldwebel was the functional equivalent of the sergeant in most armies. He commanded platoons, supervised instruction and equipment maintenance, and was the hub of daily life in any company. With a pay of 2,340 Reichsmarks annually at the start, higher than the Unterfeldwebel, and with promotions by length of service, the Feldwebel often represented the real face of command for private soldiers. In the cavalry, the equivalent was not called Feldwebel, but Wachtmeister, a title that carried centuries of Prussian military tradition. In the artillery, the term Feuerwerker designated NCOs, specialized in ammunition and artillery material. In fortress pioneer units, there were specific designations such as Wohlfeldwebel and Festungspionierfeldwebel. The Oberfeldwebel was the immediate superior rank, the NCO, who had demonstrated sufficient capacity and merit to lead with greater autonomy. He wore additional insignia, and his role in company management was broader. The Hauptfeldwebel, when this designation was used, indicated the company's senior NCO, sometimes colloquially called Spieß, a term that could be translated approximately as the anchor or the veteran, responsible for internal administration and discipline. Stabsfeldwebel, the Master Sergeant. The Stabsfeldwebel was the pinnacle of the NCO Corps. His initial pay was 2,400 Reichsmarks annually, comparable to that of some young junior officers. In terms of experience and practical authority within his sphere, he was frequently superior to many newly commissioned lieutenants. The Stabsfeldwebel knew the regulations by heart. He knew logistical procedures, supply chains, disciplinary processes. He was the man whom many young officers, arriving at the front with 6 months of academy behind them, consulted in private before making decisions that could affect lives. Manual TM-E30-451 specifically notes that in the final phases of the war, when the losses on the Eastern Front were devastating, these veteran NCOs bore a disproportionate share of the burden of maintaining the cohesion of units that had been decimated over and over again. The Fahnenjunker and the road to officer chevrons. Parallel to the ordinary NCO system, existed a special grade, the Fahnenjunker, literally flag-bearer cadet. He was the officer candidate who was fulfilling his period of service in the ranks before being sent to the academy. He occupied an ambiguous position within the hierarchy. Formally, he was an NCO with the rank of Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier or Fahnenjunker Gefreiter, but everyone knew his destiny lay elsewhere. The Oberfähnrich was the superior step of this same path, the cadet who had already completed basic academy training and was awaiting his formal commission as a lieutenant. He wore the NCO uniform, but with special distinctions that marked his provisional candidate status. The junior officers, the tier of initiative. If the non-commissioned officers were the backbone, the junior officers were the nerves, those who translated command intention into real movement on the ground. Lieutenants, Oberleutnants, Hauptmanns. Ranks that in other armies could be almost ceremonial became in the German army the critical point where mission doctrine, Auftragstaktik, either worked or failed. And when it worked, it was difficult to defeat. The officer training process, the officer training system of the German army of the Second World War is, in itself, one of the most studied subjects in the military history of the 20th century. And there are reasons for that. Before the war, access to the officer corps required passing the university entrance examination, the Abitur, as a basic educational requirement. This structurally limited the number of candidates. Working-class families without access to complete secondary education were mostly left out of the officer career path. The result was an officer corps dominated by the nobility, the professional middle class, and families with military tradition. The procedure was as follows. Recruits selected as officer candidates first served several months in their unit under supervision as aspirants. They were then sent to the officer training school in Döberitz, near Berlin, for a 6-month basic course. The program, according to the book The Wehrmacht, published by Amber Books, focused on the ability to make autonomous decisions under pressure, in what the German army called Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. Auftragstaktik deserves a specific explanation because it is inseparable from the rank structure. The central idea was that the senior commander communicated to his subordinates what he wanted to achieve, not how to do it. The officer of any rank received the freedom and the responsibility to adapt his means and methods to the real situation on the ground without waiting for additional orders. A Hauptmann who saw a tactical opportunity could seize it without consulting his battalion commander, provided his action was consistent with the superior commander's intent. This required, at all echelons, officers with real analytical capacity. Not decorative, not mechanical executors, functional military thinkers at all ranks. That is why the instruction was demanding. And that is why the quality of German officers, especially in the middle and lower ranks, was repeatedly recognized even by their enemies. Lieutenant, the second lieutenant. The lieutenant was the lowest rank within the officer corps. He commanded platoons, units of between 20 and 40 men, and was directly responsible for the training, discipline, and moral state of those men. He had 1 or 2 silver stars on his shoulder straps, over a field of color depending on the arm, white for infantry, red for artillery, black for armor, crimson for the General Staff Corps. The transformation experienced by the junior officer corps during the war was dramatic. In the early years of the conflict, the majority of colonels and majors were professional soldiers of the old Reichswehr, many of them aristocrats or sons of military families. The first waves of massive casualties in Russia and North Africa during 1941 and 1942 emptied those ranks. By the time Germany went on the defensive after Stalingrad and Kursk in 1943, the remaining veterans were commanding divisions or serving as staff officers in large general headquarters. Their positions in the lower ranks were occupied by a new generation. That new generation of lieutenants and oberleutnants came largely from the lower middle class and university-educated professions. The influence of the Nazi educational system in the 1930s meant that many of these young men had been almost completely indoctrinated with the Führer's racial ideology. In some divisions, more than a quarter of all officers were members of the Nazi Party. Oberleutnant, the first lieutenant. The Oberleutnant was the lieutenant with between 2 and 4 years of officer service, although promotions during the war accelerated at a pace that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He commanded platoons or assumed adjutant duties in companies. He wore a shoulder strap with 2 stars or with additional braid depending on the period of the war. What the Oberleutnant represented in the German system was the consolidation of tactical initiative. He had already surpassed the period of greatest fragility as a new officer, had survived his first season at the front, and had built a functional relationship with his Feldwebels and Unteroffiziers. He was in many ways the officer of greatest immediate utility in combat. Colonel Trevor Dupuy, an American military historian, calculated after the war that the German soldier inflicted casualties at a rate approximately 50% higher than he received from Allied forces under equal conditions. That difference is explained partially by training, partially by weaponry, and in no small measure by the quality of command at the Oberleutnant and Hauptmann echelons, who were the ones making decisions on the real ground. Hauptmann, the captain. The Hauptmann was the company commander. He commanded between 80 and 150 men depending on the period of the war and the type of unit. He was the echelon where administrative management merged with tactical leadership. The Hauptmann answered for the state of his company in every sense: combat, logistics, morale, discipline, training. The German company had, according to TM-E30-451 documentation, an organizational advantage that its rivals recognized. Each company contained different types of weapons and sub-units that gave it autonomous capability. This multi-arm structure allowed the Hauptmann to operate with relative tactical independence without constantly depending on external support. In the cavalry, the equivalent of the Hauptmann was the Rittmeister, a term stemming from equestrian tradition and preserved by sheer historical weight even when the cavalry had ceased fighting on horseback on most fronts. The Hauptmann's pay started from a figure that, with years of service, could reach 7,700 Reichsmarks annually. But money, in practice, mattered less than real power. The Hauptmann had authority to disciplinarily punish the men of his company and to recommend his unteroffiziers for promotion. The senior officers, the planning tier. Ascending from Hauptmann to Major was not just a matter of adding one more chevron. It was crossing a conceptual boundary that many officers never fully crossed, stopping to think about men and starting to think about units, stopping to manage combat and starting to plan it. The senior officers of the German army, from the major to the oberst, were, in the critical years of the war, the level where professional competence made the difference between holding a line and watching it break. Major, the battalion commander. The major was the natural commander of a battalion, between 400 and 800 men organized into 3 or 4 companies. It was the echelon where the officer stopped managing direct combat and began planning operations of some complexity, coordination of artillery fires, flanking maneuvers, defense of extended positions. The major was also the echelon where many German officers reached the real limit of their capabilities. The jump between the company and the battalion was not just quantitative. It implied a conceptual transformation, moving from directing men to directing units, from managing combat to planning it. Those who did it well were promoted. Those who did not stayed behind, and many died trying to compensate with personal bravery for what they lacked in staff skill. Data on the mortality of officers of this rank on the Eastern Front is eloquent. In the infantry divisions that fought without relief in Russia between 1941 and 1944, the average survival time of a frontline battalion commander did not exceed 3 or 4 months. Oberstleutnant, the lieutenant colonel. The Oberstleutnant was frequently the second in command of a regiment or the commander of a reinforced battalion. It was the echelon that in the German system functioned as an organizational pivot, senior enough to plan complex operations but still close to the actual front. A particularly documented case is that of Oberstleutnant Werner Marx, who at some point during the North African campaign organized and commanded a tactical group that bore his name, amalgamating elements from different units of the 2nd Panzer Division. This ability to improvise coherent units from scattered fragments, the Kampfgruppen, was the practical corollary of Auftragstaktik, and in it Oberstleutnants and Obersts played a crucial role. Oberst, the colonel. The Oberst was the regimental commander. 3 regiments typically formed a division, although the composition varied according to the period of the war and the type of unit. The Oberst was responsible for between 3,000 and 5,000 men in combat, with the support of a small but functional staff. Oberst Hermann Balck, who commanded the 2nd Panzer Regiment during part of the Western Front campaign in 1940, was cited in the book The Wehrmacht as an example of a commander who applied mission command doctrine with exceptional effectiveness. Balck would eventually reach the rank of general, but his achievements at the Oberst echelon defined his reputation. The book The Wehrmacht points out that the German officer corps at the Oberst and Major echelon was, at the end of the war, the last line of real cohesion for many units. Upon the shoulders of a small group of veterans, colonels and majors, fell the burden of keeping together the disintegrated fragments of the army. When divisions were decimated over and over again by Allied firepower or overrun by masses of Soviet tanks, small groups of German soldiers led by determined commanders formed ad hoc groupings to try to close the gap in the front line. The pay of an Oberst on active service, according to the scale published before the war, could exceed 12,000 Reichsmarks annually with length of service supplements, placing him among the best remunerated members of the army below the rank of general. The generals, the elite within the elite. The general officer tier of the German army in the Second World War is perhaps the one that has received the most historical attention, and with good reason. Within it were made the decisions that determined the course of the war. But it is also the echelon where the tensions between military competence and the political dynamics of the Third Reich manifested with the greatest intensity. A fact that the book The Wehrmacht presents with precision. By mid-July 1944, there were more than 2,000 generals in the German army. Out of those 2,000, only 35 actively participated in the July 20, 1944 plot against Hitler. The rest, the overwhelming majority, remained loyal, looked the other way in the face of atrocities, and kept fighting until the end. General Major, the Brigadier General. The General Major was the entry-level rank to the generalate. He commanded divisions, units of between 10,000 and 16,000 men with organic artillery, engineers, logistics, and dedicated signals, or served as the Chief of Staff of an army corps. Eduard Dietl described in the book The Wehrmacht as a fox-faced Austrian in whom Hitler placed considerable trust, held the rank of General Major when he commanded the troops that landed at Narvik in April 1940 during the Norwegian campaign. With barely 10 destroyers and minimal forces, his men found themselves in a tactically desperate position, subjected to attacks by superior Allied forces. Dietl held the position. Erich von Lewinsky-Manstein was General Major and Chief of Staff of Army Group A when, together with Senior Commander Gerd von Rundstedt, he submitted for consideration the bold operational plan through the Ardennes that would change the course of the Second World War in the West. His subsequent rise was meteoric, but the plan that defined Manstein's genius was conceived as a General Major. General Lieutenant, the Major General. The General Lieutenant normally commanded a division or could ascend to the command of an army corps. It was the echelon where the general had to demonstrate the ability to effectively coordinate multiple arms, infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, in operations of some scale. Erwin Rommel was General Lieutenant when he received command of the 7th Panzer Division in February 1940, just before the French campaign. His leadership style, characterized by his almost constant presence at the front, was the epitome of the German commander doctrine that the book The Wehrmacht describes. On many occasions, the day was saved by the rapid intervention of division or corps commanders who were in the right place at the right time to order a counterattack or push an advance. General der Infanterie and its equivalents. The rank of General der Infanterie, or General der Panzertruppe, General der Artillerie, General der Pionier, etc., depending on the arm, was the functional equivalent of a lieutenant general in most armies of the era. He commanded armies or army groups in some cases. The designation of the arm within the rank was a Prussian tradition that the German army deliberately preserved. A General der Infanterie was someone who had risen through the infantry, which implied a specific perspective on ground warfare. A General der Panzertruppe had made his career in the armoured forces. The rank was not merely honorary, it reflected the doctrinal training and operational mindset of the officer. Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of modern armoured warfare, reached the rank of General der Panzertruppe before ascending to General Oberst. His influence on the doctrine of employment for armoured forces, set down in his work Achtung, Panzer, published in 1937, was decisive for the development of the Blitzkrieg concept. General Oberst, the Colonel General. The General Oberst was the second highest rank within the ordinary generalate, and in practice commanded complete armies or even army groups during certain periods of the war. It was a rank of enormous prestige in the German system, above the General der Infanterie, but below the General Feldmarschall. Paul Hausser, a former Reichswehr general who joined the Waffen-SS in 1934 and was appointed inspector of the armed SS 2 years later, reached the equivalent of the Generaloberst grade in the Waffen-SS structure, Oberstgruppenführer und Generaloberst der Waffen-SS. This dual title illustrates the complexity of the parallel system the SS had built. Then, Generaloberst Fedor von Bock commanded one of the two major groupings of the German army at the start of the Poland campaign in September 1939 with Army Group North. Throughout the war, the rank of Generaloberst was occupied by some of the most capable and also some of the most controversial commanders of the Wehrmacht. The Generalfeldmarschall, the supreme rank. The Generalfeldmarschall was the highest rank in the German army. Unlike the Reichsmarschall, which, as we will see, was a unique and unrepeatable rank, the Generalfeldmarschall was a grade of the regular system that could be reached through promotion. Its bearer carried the baton, an ivory and silver object symbolizing absolute authority in the theater of operations. The baton was not an empty symbol. According to Prussian tradition, and the German army preserved that tradition with an almost liturgical rigor, the Feldmarschall was the personal representative of the head of state on the battlefield. His authority in theory had no limits within his zone of operations. In practice, under Hitler, that authority was systematically eroded until it became a formality. Hitler promoted 12 generals to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall on July 19, 1940, following the victory over France. It was the largest collective promotion act to the highest grade in German military history. Among the 12 were Gerd von Rundstedt, Wilhelm von Lieb, Fedor von Bock, Wilhelm Keitel, Walter von Brauchitsch, Albert Kesselring, Erhard Milch, Hugo Sperle, and several others. The ceremony in Berlin was deliberate. Hitler was rewarding a victory that had largely been made possible thanks to his own strategic intuitions, or at least that was what he wanted the world to believe. Erich von Manstein was promoted to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall in February 1943 after organizing the counterattack that recaptured Kharkov and saved the southern flank of the Eastern Front from a potentially catastrophic collapse. The Soviets, who had overextended themselves dangerously after Stalingrad, were pushed back, losing Kharkov, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of men. It was one of the most brilliant counterattacks of the entire war. Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model, described by the book The Wehrmacht as a competent commander who suffered Hitler's constant meddling, commanded Army Group B during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Hitler, from his headquarters, personally chose the routes the panzer divisions were to follow on the map, without any knowledge of the actual terrain conditions. Model, along with several of his subordinates, strongly opposed the scope of the offensive, considering it too ambitious, but Hitler paid no attention. Albert Kesselring, the only Luftwaffe Generalfeldmarschall who commanded a land theatre for a sustained period, directed Army Group C in Italy from 1943 until the end of the war. His success in halting the Allied advance at the Gothic Line, using the Italian mountainous terrain with a mastery that his opponents publicly acknowledged, caused Hitler to let him operate with unusual autonomy. He smiles at the sun and seems born to rule Italy, an Allied officer wrote of him in 1944. Maximilian Freiherr von Weichs was promoted to the grade of Generalfeldmarschall in January 1943 and received the responsibility of maintaining control over the Balkans during the last 2 years of the war, supervising operations against Greek, Albanian and Yugoslav partisans with more than 600,000 men under his nominal command. The list of those promoted to the maximum grade also includes Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, whose role was for a long time the subject of historical controversy. Keitel was known among German officers by the nickname Leihkittel, a sarcastic contraction of Lakai, lackey, and his own surname, for his willingness to countersign any order coming from the Führer's headquarters, including those for the execution of prisoners and civilians. He was tried and sentenced to death at Nuremberg. The grade of Generalfeldmarschall never exceeded 19 holders throughout the entire war, including those of the Luftwaffe. Each of them was, in formal terms, the maximum depository of military authority in their theatre of operations. In real terms, they were men caught between their professional training and the erratic will of a politician who had assumed supreme operational command. The Reichsmarschall, a unique rank in history. Above all Generalfeldmarschälle, there existed a rank unprecedented in German military history, the Reichsmarschall des Großdeutschen Reiches. It was a rank created specifically for a single man, Hermann Wilhelm Göring. Hermann Göring had been an elite fighter pilot during the First World War, leader of the legendary Richthofen Squadron after the death of the Red Baron, and bearer of the Pour le Mérite Order, the highest military distinction of the Kaiserreich. That background granted him a military legitimacy that the purely political hierarchs of the Nazi regime did not possess. On July 19, 1940, the same day Hitler promoted 12 generals to the grade of General Feldmarschall, he created the rank of Reichsmarschall for Göring. The uniform was spectacular, white with gold details, featuring a unique baton studded with precious stones. It was, visually, the most visible and unmistakable rank of the entire Third Reich hierarchy. In practice, however, Göring declined as an effective military figure as the Luftwaffe failed mission after mission. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that German aviation could not by itself subdue a well-organized adversary. The failure of the airlift to Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, which Göring had personally promised Hitler he could sustain, was the most dramatic demonstration of the empty promises that had characterized his management. And as Allied bombing devastated German cities, the Reichsmarschall's credibility evaporated. By 1945, Göring was addicted to narcotics, obese to the point of physical indignity, and politically irrelevant. When he attempted to assume power in the final days of the regime, arguing that Hitler, surrounded in Berlin, could no longer fulfill his functions, the Führer expelled him from the party and had him arrested. A month later, in May 1945, Göring surrendered to US forces. The rank of Reichsmarschall died with the capitulation of the Third Reich. It did not exist before July 1940. It did not exist after May 1945. One rank for one man in a regime that lasted 12 years. The Waffen-SS, a parallel rank system. The German army was not the only protagonist of the Third Reich's war. Alongside it, and frequently in open competition with it, operated a second army, the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, which by the end of the war grew to nearly 40 divisions and several corps and army headquarters. The Waffen-SS had its own system of ranks, parallel to but deliberately different from that of the army. The ranks bore titles combining Nazi jargon with military nomenclature, and the visual difference from the army uniform was marked. The national insignia, the eagle with the swastika, was worn on the left arm instead of the right chest. On the helmet, the national colors were replaced by the SS symbol. The collar rank insignia were distinct, featuring oak leaves for the senior ranks and rhombuses or pips for the junior officer ranks. The basic structure was as follows, according to the rank appendix in the book The Wehrmacht. At the enlisted level, the SS Schütze was equivalent to the Army Schütze, and the SS Oberschütze was his immediate superior equivalent. In the first step of distinction, the SS Sturmmann was the equivalent of the Gefreiter, and the SS Rottenführer corresponded to the Obergefreiter. In the junior NCOs, the SS Unterscharführer was equivalent to the Unteroffizier, the SS Scharführer to the Unterfeldwebel, the SS Oberscharführer to the Feldwebel, the SS Hauptscharführer to the Oberfeldwebel, the SS Stabsscharführer had an approximate equivalent in the Hauptfeldwebel, and the SS Sturmscharführer corresponded to the Army Stabsfeldwebel. In the junior officers, the SS Untersturmführer was the equivalent of the Leutnant, the SS Obersturmführer of the Oberleutnant, the SS Hauptsturmführer of the Hauptmann. In the senior officers, the SS Sturmbannführer corresponded to the Major, the SS Obersturmbannführer to the Oberstleutnant, the SS Standartenführer to the Oberst, and the SS Oberführer was a rank without an exact equivalent in the army, situated between the Standartenführer and the Brigadeführer. In the General Eight, the SS Brigadeführer was equivalent to the General Major, the SS Gruppenführer to the General Leutnant, the SS Obergruppenführer to the General der Infanterie, the SS Oberstgruppenführer to the General Oberst, and at the top was the Reichsführer SS, a unique rank reserved for Heinrich Himmler, the supreme head of the entire SS organization. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler had no formal equivalent within the army rank system. In terms of real power, however, Himmler was in many respects more powerful than any army general-feldmarschall. He controlled the police, the concentration camps, the internal security apparatus, and his own private army. The rivalry between the army and the SS was permanent and vicious throughout the entire war. Paul Hauser, a former Reichswehr officer who had joined the SS in 1934 and became an inspector and later a combat commander, reached the grade of Oberstgruppenführer und Generaloberst der Waffen-SS, the second highest rank within the SS hierarchy. His men affectionately called him Papa Hauser, and his influence on the tactical doctrine of the Waffen-SS was decisive. In February 1943, Hauser made a decision that would have resulted in his summary execution if it had gone wrong. He cut radio contact with the Führer's headquarters and evacuated Kharkov, ignoring Hitler's order to defend the city to the last man. The reconquest of the city the following month saved his life and his career. The elite divisions of the Waffen-SS, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Viking, came to be recognized even by their enemies as top-quality combat units. But the organization also included units of a radically different nature. The book The Wehrmacht documents 3 cases illustrating that other extreme. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, Jürgen Stroop, and Dr. Oskar Dirlewanger. Stroop, commander of the SS in Warsaw during April and May 1943, mobilized 820 Waffen-SS men, 200 SS police officers, and 350 Ukrainian and Latvian volunteers to suppress the Jewish ghetto uprising. The combat lasted nearly a month. In the end, Stroop reported 5,000 Jews dead in explosions and fires, 7,000 during the fighting, and another 7,000 more during the transfer of survivors to the Treblinka extermination camp. The entire ghetto was subsequently demolished. Alfred Jodl himself, chief of the OKW operations staff, referred to Stroop as a filthy and arrogant SS pig when the officer presented a book about his glorious victory. Dirlewanger was a child rapist with prior convictions who at one point had even been expelled from the SS itself for drunkenness. His brigade, later converted into a division, was recruited primarily from violent criminals. When, on some occasion, he was assigned a sector of the actual front, his men deserted en masse, and he was the first to abandon the position. The simultaneous existence of these two worlds within the Waffen-SS, that of the elite divisions and that of the criminal units, sums up the schizophrenic nature of the Third Reich. A system that could produce, in the same uniform and under the same symbol, both frontline soldiers and mass murderers. The Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, 2 parallel systems. The army of the Third Reich did not fight in a vacuum. Alongside it operated the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, each with its own complete system of ranks, parallel to that of the army but with its own designations. The Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe's rank system followed the exact same grading structure as the army, but used different titles. At the enlisted level, the equivalent of the Schütze/Grenadier was the Flieger. The system of Gefreiter, Obergefreiter, Hauptgefreiter, and Stabsgefreiter also existed in the Luftwaffe with the same names but with different visual insignia. In the non-commissioned officers, the ranks of Unteroffizier, Unterfeldwebel, Feldwebel, Oberfeldwebel, and Stabsfeldwebel were identical in designation to those of the army. The rank insignia, however, differed. On the shoulder straps, the Luftwaffe wings gave a specific visual touch, and the collar patches distinguished the different groups with the number of pairs of wings, 1 to 4, combined with oak leaves or wreaths. The base color of the uniform was blue-gray, unlike the grayish-green of the army. The field cap, the Fliegermütze, had a more slanted profile than the army's, a detail that airmen cultivated with a certain corporate pride. In the Generalate, the Luftwaffe produced its own general majors, general lieutenants, generals der Luftwaffe, Generalobersts, and Generalfeldmarschälle. Albert Kesselring was promoted to Luftwaffe Generalfeldmarschall in February 1942 before assuming command of the Mediterranean Theatre. Erhard Milch, who directed the German aviation industry, also reached the rank of Luftwaffe Generalfeldmarschall in 1940. The range of colours to distinguish arms and specialties within the Luftwaffe was different from that of the army: white for generals, golden yellow for flight crews, bright red for anti-aircraft artillery, and golden brown for signal troops. The Luftwaffe paratrooper troops, the Fallschirmjäger, wore special uniforms with blue-grey trousers and the flight jacket. Men who had completed at least 6 jumps wore a special insignia: a silver diving eagle with a swastika in its talons, framed by a golden wreath. The Kriegsmarine. The German Navy's rank system followed traditional naval nomenclature with terms that in many cases had no direct translation to the land military system. At the base of the scale was the Matros, the private sailor. The Gefreiter's system was designated with the Matrosen prefix: Matrosengefreiter, Matrosen-Obergefreiter, Matrosen-Hauptgefreiter, Matrosen-Stabsgefreiter. Kriegsmarine non-commissioned officers used their own designations. Maat was equivalent to the Unteroffizier, Obermacht-Oberwachtmeister to the next level, Feldwebel, this one with the same name as in the army, and so on up to the Stabsfeldwebel. In the officers, the scale began with the Leutnant zur See, followed by the Oberleutnant zur See, the Kapitänleutnant, the Korvettenkapitän, the Fregattenkapitän, the Kapitän zur See, and the Commodore, the latter without an exact equivalent in the army system. The naval generalate followed the hierarchy of admirals: Konteradmiral, Vice-Admiral, Admiral, General Admiral, and finally the Gross Admiral, the naval equivalent of the General Feldmarschall. The only Gross Admiral who exercised the rank with full authority during the Second World War was Karl Dönitz, the architect of the German submarine war and Hitler's designated successor in the final days of the regime. Erich Raeder, the previous commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, also held the rank until his resignation in January 1943 following the failure at the Battle of the Barents Sea. The insignia: how power was read on the uniform. In the army of the Third Reich, power was visible. Any soldier could know in a matter of seconds what rank the man in front of him held, simply by looking at his uniform insignia. That visual system of hierarchy was so precise and deliberate that Allied manuals dedicated entire sections to it. Rank insignia were worn primarily on the shoulder straps and complementarily on the collar patches. Shoulder straps were divided into 5 main categories depending on the amount of visible cord or braid. Enlisted troops without distinction wore a plain cloth strap. The first step of distinction, Gefreiter and above within the enlisted ranks, added chevrons to the left arm. Non-commissioned officers wore straps with a silver braid bordering the sides, with the number and complexity of the braid distinguishing the different echelons. Officers wore straps woven in silver aluminum cord over a colour field indicating the branch: white for infantry, crimson for the General Staff Corps, black for armoured troops, red for artillery, and so on. The number of silver stars: Lieutenant with no stars or with 1 star depending on the period, Oberleutnant with 1, Hauptmann with 2, and so on, completed the information. Generals wore straps with gold thread braid or thick aluminum braid, combined with varying numbers and sizes of stars. The General Feldmarschall wore double gold-braided straps with the most elaborate insignia in the system. On the collar patches, an additional distinction existed. Generals wore a red patch with a stylized gold oak leaf, the unmistakable mark of their rank. Non-commissioned officers had an additional silver band around 2 sides of the patch. Mid-level officers wore the plain double-band patch. The branch colour, called Waffenfarbe in German, was another layer of information. It appeared on the piping of the cap and the piping of the shoulder straps, covering the entirety of the army's arms and specialties: white for infantry, red for artillery, black for combat engineer troops and armoured troops, golden yellow for cavalry, olive green for mountain troops, cornflower blue for medical services, crimson for the general staff, bottle green for mountain infantry troops, burgundy for chemical warfare troops, light blue for transport and supply troops, light grey for propaganda troops. The General Staff Corps, crimson, also wore a crimson stripe on the trousers, visible from a distance. This stripe was the visual equivalent of a university degree within the army. It indicated that the bearer had passed the extremely demanding tests of the General Staff examination, a process that rigorously filtered candidates and produced the most capable operational planners in the system. For special uniforms, protective coveralls for tank crews, snowsuits, work clothes, which lacked shoulder straps and collar patches, a left-sleeve rank insignia was introduced, starting in September 1942, featuring oak leaves and bars embroidered in gold thread for generals and in light green thread for lower ranks. The General Staff Corps, the brain of the system. Within the hierarchy of the German army, there existed an elite within the elite, the General Staff Corps, whose members wore the crimson stripe on their trousers and were collectively known as the Red Pants, in German the Generalstabler. The General Staff Corps was not a rank in itself, but a qualification that could be held by officers from the rank of Major to General Feldmarschall. But in practice, being a member of the General Staff determined the trajectory of a career just as decisively as any rank promotion. The access process was brutal in its demands. First, the candidate had to be nominated by his superiors. Then he went through a series of tests and interviews. Those who passed this first filter were admitted to the War Academy, the Kriegsmarine, in Berlin for a 2-year program. Fewer than half of the candidates completed it. Those who reached the end of the program were assigned to staff positions at different echelons of the army, systematically progressing between staff assignments and combat unit commands. The Chief of the Army General Staff appointed and promoted General Staff Corps officers according to document TM-E30-451. All other officer promotions, except those of the General Staff, went through the Personnel Office, Heeres Personalamt. Promotions to Colonel and General were decided directly by Hitler. The Army General Headquarters, OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, was structured around the Chief of Staff and 4 Deputy Chiefs of Operations, Oberquartiermeister 1-4, each responsible for different departments. The Operations Section, Abteilung 1A, was reserved exclusively for officers of the General Staff Corps. The Intelligence Section, Abteilung 1C, the Logistics Section, the Personnel Section. All had their own chains of command, but key positions in all of them were occupied by Generalstabler. The distinction between the OKH and the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, is fundamental to understanding the real power structure of the Third Reich. The OKW was, in theory, the coordinating body of all branches of the armed forces. In practice, according to Mellenthin's testimony, it never grew beyond being Hitler's personal planning staff. The chiefs of the different branches rarely met together, except in formal sessions, to receive orders directly from the Führer. There was no real coordination, no joint staff in the Allied or Soviet sense of the term. This structural fracture at the top had devastating operational consequences. German resources, always scarce compared to the Allies, could never be optimized because no agency had real authority to prioritize them. Hitler deliberately designed it that way. The regional organization, the Wehrkreise and the recruitment system. Below the operational level, the German army maintained a regional administration and recruitment structure organized around the Wehrkreise, military districts. Each Wehrkreis corresponded approximately to a territorial army corps and was commanded by a senior officer who also commanded the army corps bearing the same Roman numeral. This structure had a total war logic. In the event of conflict, the Wehrkreis activated the mobilization of its zone, equipped and trained newly formed units, and sent them to the front. The temporary barracks, which TME30-451 describes as brick facilities for between 150 and 200 men, served as transit points for recruits. The individual recruitment process was equally precise. Local recruitment offices received men of military age, carried out physical classification and aptitude evaluation, and assigned them to the corresponding units or specialties. There was no active duty military officer in the local registration offices. That function was performed by the recruitment office officials themselves, but supervision of the system fell to the General Army Office, Allgemeines Heeresamt, which formulated recruitment and personnel distribution plans. Before entering the army proper, all young Germans passed through the Reich Labor Service, the Reichsarbeitsdienst or RAD. This paramilitary organization physically hardened recruits and accustomed them to living and working in groups under military discipline, meaning that when they arrived at their army units, they already possessed a physical foundation and a collective mindset that significantly reduced the time needed for basic training. Concurrently, specialized instruction was imparted through the naval and air sections of the Hitler Youth, the Marine Hitlerjugend and the Flieger Hitlerjugend in gliding schools, and in the competition programs of the National Socialist Flyers Corps, NSFK. By 1944, the German training system counted 305 infantry training battalions plus 49 Panzer Grenadier training battalions, 13 tank training battalions, 49 artillery training battalions, and 15 service training battalions. It was a gigantic machinery processing around 128,000 men per month at its peak activity point. Pay, decorations, and motivation. A rank system does not exist in a vacuum. It needs reward and motivation mechanisms that maintain the commitment of those who make it up, from the Schütze in the trench to the General Feldmarschall in his headquarters. The peacetime pay scale of the German army was relatively precise and stratified. At the pinnacle, the commander-in-chief of a branch of the armed forces or the chief of the Wehrmacht General Staff received 26,550 Reichsmarks annually. The General Oberst received a base of 24,000 Reichsmarks annually. The system descended down to the 1,080 Reichsmarks annually of the base grenadier or infantry soldier. But those were peacetime. During the war, the regime introduced the Wehrsold, wartime pay, a considerably reduced amount that was supplemented by special allowances based on the type of front, family status, and combat merit. Officers were paid monthly in advance. Private soldiers received their pay on the 1st and 21st of each month. More important than pay were decorations. The Iron Cross remained the emblem of German valor in 1939 to 1945, exactly as it had in 1914 to 1918. The full scale of the Iron Cross had several tiers: the Iron Cross Second Class, the First Class, the Knight's Cross, Ritterkreuz, and its 4 higher grades with oak leaves and swords, with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, and in the unique case of Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated Stuka pilot of the war, with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the highest decoration awarded throughout the entire conflict. Other decorations recognized specific merits. The Infantry Assault Badge was awarded to those who had participated in 3 combat assaults on different days. The Wound Badge had 3 classes depending on the number and severity of wounds received. Campaign medals recorded participation in specific theaters. For generals, the regime added incentives of a different nature. The book The Wehrmacht notes that cash bonuses for high ranks were substantial. 100,000 Reichsmarks accompanied promotion to the rank of General Major. Additionally, large houses and estates were given as personal gifts from the Führer to the most prominent generals. Manstein, Guderian, and Rommel received donations of this type at different times during the war. It was a mechanism for buying loyalty that the regime used systematically with its top military commanders. The collapsing system, the final months and the meaning of the ranks. In the final months of the war, something strange happened to the German army's rank system. The system formally remained intact. Uniforms still marked the grades. Salutes continued to be rendered. But the real substance of the ranks, the ability to execute the functions corresponding to each echelon, had evaporated in many sectors of the front. An Oberst who in 1941 commanded a regiment of 3 battalions with a full complement of 3,000 men commanded in 1945 a grouping that at best gathered 400 or 500 combatants. A general major who before Kursk commanded a division of 14,000 men with organic artillery and its own support units could find himself at the head of an emergency Kampfgruppe formed with whatever was available: cooks, mechanics, convalescents fresh out of the field hospital, and half a dozen tanks that still worked. The Oberfeldwebels and Stabsfeldwebels, the veteran NCOs who had been the connective tissue of the system, had been dying off since 1941. Those remaining in 1944 and 1945 were men of incalculable value precisely because they were the last, the final custodians of a military culture that had taken decades to form and that the war was destroying in months. The fate of the senior ranks was paradoxically more dramatic. Hitler, who by late 1941 had appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army, formalizing his micromanagement of the Eastern Front, dismissed his generals one after another when results did not match his expectations. Von Brauchitsch in December 1941, Halder in September 1942, Manstein in March 1944, Guderian in March 1945. Each dismissal was both a symptom and a cause of the deterioration of German command. The final paradox is that the German army's rank system, designed to guarantee command coherence and the quality of tactical initiative, was fundamentally destroyed by the man who held the title of highest authority in that system, Adolf Hitler, who distrusted his generals, ignored their professional judgment, and maintained control until the end over decisions that no political command should have ever made. General Mellenthin articulated it clearly in his memoirs. In democratic states, the branches of the armed forces and the different aspects of the war economy were firmly coordinated. But in Germany there existed a strange separation into independent powers. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the SS, the Organization Todt, the NSDAP, the commissariats, the numerous branches of the economy, all worked separately, receiving orders directly from Hitler. The reason was undoubtedly Hitler's lust for power and his distrust of any independent force. What the ranks reveal about the Third Reich. The hierarchy of the German army during the Second World War is, in many ways, a mirror of the Third Reich itself. Technically brilliant in its internal architecture, profoundly dysfunctional in its relationship with political power, and morally compromised in ways that tactical skill cannot redeem. The rank system of the Heer, the ground army, was the heir to a 2-century-old Prussian tradition that had produced some of the sharpest military minds in European history. Auftragstaktik, the mission command system that endowed every echelon of the chain of command with real initiative, was a concept so far ahead of its time that Western armies took decades to formally adopt it, paradoxically in many cases through the systematic study of the German experience in the Second World War. But that same hierarchical architecture served to transmit criminal orders. The division, corps, and army commanders who carried out orders for the execution of Soviet prisoners of war, the deportation of civilians, and participation in the Holocaust, all of them had ranks, insignia, shoulder straps, and careers to defend, and the majority chose to comply. At the Nuremberg trials, the ranks that had been a source of pride became evidence of responsibility. General Feldmarschall Keitel was sentenced to death. General Feldmarschall Manstein was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He served 4. Reichsmarschall Göring committed suicide hours before his execution. Ranks did not protect their bearers from the consequences of their actions. American Colonel Trevor Dupuy, in his quantitative analysis of the effectiveness of German combat, concluded that the German soldier inflicted casualties at a rate 50% higher than he received under equivalent conditions. He attributed this difference, in conjunction with equipment, doctrine, and unit cohesion, fundamentally to the quality of leadership at all echelons. But that quality of leadership did not arise from the Nazi regime. It arose in spite of it, inherited from the Reichswehr, cultivated in military academies, preserved in the tradition of the general staffs. What the regime contributed was the political context that turned that capability into an instrument of conquest and crime. 21 steps separated the Schütze from the General Feldmarschall. 21 steps of command, responsibility, and authority. And in all of them, to a greater or lesser degree, the same dynamic played out. Men with real capabilities, trained in a system that valued initiative and competence, serving a regime that needed them competent enough to win battles and docile enough not to ask uncomfortable questions. That tension between professional excellence and moral complicity defines the history of the Nazi army's ranks. And it remains, 80 years later, one of the most disturbing enigmas in 20th century history.